At the village square, children and youths laughed and played under the warm sun. The sound of skipping ropes, clapping hands, and happy chatter filled the air. Suddenly, someone shouted, "Mr. Ray's car is coming!" Heads turned, and in an instant, everything stopped. From a distance, a shiny black car moved slowly into view. It wasn't every day Mr. Ray came to the village. The children and youths screamed in excitement, running to the dusty road. "Mr. Ray! Mr. Ray!" they shouted, waving their hands wildly. They chased the car. Some running barefoot, others in old sandals. The car rolled on as if enjoying the attention, its driver steering carefully so no one got hurt. Inside the car, Mr. Ray sat at the back, leaning comfortably. His wide grin stretched from ear to ear as he heard their cheers. "Ah, these children love me," he said, laughing softly. The car finally stopped at his big compound, a place with high walls and a large gate. The children surrounded the car, clapping and chanting, "Mr. Ray, our hero! Mr. Ray, the great man!" Mr. Ray stepped out slowly, looking around with a proud smile. His shoes sparkled, and his sweet-smelling perfume filled the air. He waved at the crowd, and they screamed louder. Without a word, he walked into his big house. Once inside, he shut the door and went straight to his private room. It was dark and quiet, with only a dim oil lamp lighting the space. Mr. Ray bent down and reached under his bed. He pulled out a large, ancient-looking calabash. Its surface was worn and shiny, with strange carvings along the edges. He whispered something to himself, almost like a song or a chant, and smiled again. Mr. Ray carefully lifted the lid and smiled. When he saw the bundles of money inside, he stacked them neatly in his hands and muttered to himself, "Let's keep them happy." When he stepped outside again holding the money, the crowd went wild. The children screamed, "Mr. Ray! Mr. Ray!" as they jumped up and down. He sat on a wooden chair in the middle of the compound and began handing out the money. One by one, he gave each youth and child a few notes, their hands trembling with excitement as they collected it. "Thank you, Mr. Ray!" they shouted. "You are the best!" The children began to dance, and their singing filled the air. They clapped their hands and spun in circles, singing songs to praise him. In Amigo village, there was no one as famous as Mr. Ray. He was not just the richest man in the village, he was also the kindest. Everyone in Amigo had a story about how Mr. Ray had helped them. If a child couldn't afford school fees, Mr. Ray would pay for them to go to school. When the community needed a church, Mr. Ray built one, complete with a tall bell that rang every Sunday morning. Widows, who often struggled to feed their children, knew they could rely on Mr. Ray to give them money every month. And during hard times, when there wasn't enough food to go around, he would show up with bags of rice, beans, and other foodstuffs to share with the villagers. The youths loved him most of all. Whenever they needed money for their small businesses, Mr. Ray would help. If there was a football tournament in a neighboring village, he would sponsor their team. It was no surprise that the whole village adored him, calling him Papa Amigo, the father of the village. But there was one event that everyone in Amigo looked forward to the most. The New Year's Eve celebration at Mr. Ray's big compound. For 20 years, since the day he became rich, Mr. Ray had been throwing this grand party every year. The celebration was magical, and people talked about it for months afterward. The night finally came, and Mr. Ray's compound was alive with excitement. Bright lanterns lit up the large yard, making everything look beautiful. The air was filled with the smell of delicious food, and music played loudly, making people dance and smile. The youths and children, dressed in their best clothes, started arriving. They laughed, talked, and waited eagerly for the celebration to begin. Big pots of rice, meat, and soup were cooking in the kitchen, and bottles of drinks were stacked high. At exactly midnight, Mr. Ray walked to the center of the compound. He raised his hand, and the music stopped. Everyone became silent, their eyes fixed on him. He smiled and spoke warmly. "My people, I welcome you. It's a new year, and we thank God for keeping us alive. Tonight we celebrate as one family." The crowd clapped and cheered. Then, as part of the tradition, Mr. Ray asked everyone to come forward. Servants brought out small bowls of clean water. "Please wash your hands before we eat," Mr. Ray said. The children giggled as the cool water touched their fingers. The youths joked, splashing a little water on each other, while the adults washed their hands quietly. The servants carefully collected all the used water and poured it into a large clay pot hidden behind the house. Once everyone had washed their hands, the feast began. Plates of rice, fried chicken, plantains, and spicy soup were served to everyone. People ate happily, laughing and talking as the music started again. Children danced in the middle of the compound, spinning and clapping, while the youths showed off their best moves. As the night came to an end, Mr. Ray handed out gifts. Each person received a bag of rice, and their faces lit up with joy. "Thank you, Papa Amigo," they said, bowing. "May God bless you." By the time everyone left, the compound was quiet again. Mr. Ray stood at the entrance, watching the last person disappear into the night. His cheerful face changed, his smile was gone, replaced by a serious look. He turned and walked into his house, heading straight for a secret room. The room was dark, with only a dim lamp glowing in the corner. In the middle of the room stood a large altar, covered with a black cloth. On the altar was a wooden carving of a giant python. Mr. Ray carried the pot of water everyone had washed their hands with into the room slowly. He placed it in front of the altar. Then he removed his fine clothes and tied a black wrapper around his waist. His movements were slow and careful, as if he didn't want to disturb something. He knelt in front of the altar and began to chant in a low voice. His words were strange, and they echoed in the quiet room. Suddenly, a soft hissing sound came from the altar. Out of the shadows, a huge python slithered forward. Its body was long and shiny, and its red eyes glowed like fire. The snake moved slowly, its head raised high as it stared at Mr. Ray. The python slid toward the pot of water. Its forked tongue flicked out as it began to drink. The water disappeared quickly, as the snake's large body coiled tightly around the base of the altar. Mr. Ray didn't move, he stayed on his knees, bowing deeply. "Great One," he whispered, his voice shaking. Thank you for your blessings. Please continue to give me wealth and power this year. When the python finished drinking, it raised its head and hissed loudly. Then it slithered back into the shadows behind the altar. The room became silent again. Mr. Ray stood up slowly, his face calm, but his eyes glowing with something dark. He tied the pot shut, adjusted his wrapper, and left the room, locking the door behind him. The next morning, Mr. Ray woke up, feeling strange. He sat up in bed and looked down at his legs. They were swollen, twice their normal size. His eyes widened, and his heart began to beat faster. He knew what this meant. This has happened before, he whispered to himself. His mind raced back to the last time. It was when a man in the village almost escaped his trap. Someone whose family missed the New Year celebration. Back then, Mr. Ray had called on the snake at his altar. The snake had told him that one of the man's family members must wash their hands in the water and collect a gift to bind them. That time, Mr. Ray had acted quickly. He had invited the man's mother, a poor woman with a sick child. She had refused to come at first, saying her youngest child was very sick. But Mr. Ray pretended to be kind. He gave her food and water to wash her hands. Then, as she was leaving, he offered to follow her to the hospital and help with her child's treatment. The woman had been so grateful. She didn't know the real reason Mr. Ray wanted her there. Now, sitting in his bed, Mr. Ray groaned and grabbed his swollen legs. Who missed my party this time? He asked angrily. He quickly got up and went straight to his secret room. Mr. Ray knelt before the altar, clapping his hands 3 times. Great One, I call you, he said loudly. Suddenly, the room grew colder. The sound of a snake's hiss filled the air. A shadow appeared again. The giant python slithered forward. This time, it was ready to strike.